be in Boulder to be with such a remarkable group of people. As I go back and forth around the world and across the country, watching Colorado's bench get richer and richer and richer, it's just remarkable. Jenny, you're a very good example of what's being grown here and what excellence there is. Amy, that was a marvelous presentation. I love the idea of all students getting registered. It makes so much sense. Bill, always a pleasure to be with you, and you're a great model for us all. Bill, you got, if you don't have Bill Becker's newsletter, you got to get it. It's the best that there is. Jena has to leave very quickly. So I thought I'd just start with, try to lay out very quickly 3 themes that I hope we can touch on. One would be, I would call, the tentacles of the fossil fuel community. Second, the responsibility of our financial institutions. And third, the makeup of our politics and processes. All 3 of these, it seems to me, are threatening our ability to maintain a sustainable world. Fossil fuel communities, financial institutions, and our political institutions. Jenny, you've got to run quickly, so I know maybe you want to comment on that before you have to go out the door.
I agree. I agree, and I think, gosh, we are how many years past the insurrection? 3 years past the insurrection, still in the worst attack on democracy we've seen. And it's very easy to say, well, we have to get back to where we were in 2019. But where we were in 2019 was big polluters able to put endless amounts of money into our politics to try to influence who gets elected, to influence what ballot questions are passed, how our state constitution has changed. We already had an instability of American government where, honestly, Senator, people who grow up like me in a cabin with an outhouse outside on food stamps don't get elected to office. And then on top of that, all the gerrymandering. So I think the fact of it is that government coincides, or a failing governmental election system coincides with big polluters. Not having good representation in government means folks who are at the forefront of a climate crisis don't have their voices heard. And I agree with you on the financial institution piece.
Great. Well, that gets us a start. Amy, would you like to make a quick comment as a starter? So what are the greatest challenges facing us and our ability to manage or maybe try to get on top of the climate crisis? What prohibits us from making more progress?
Well, is this on? Yeah. So as a large public institution, we're nonpartisan, neutral brokers in science and research. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is misinformation and communication, especially now with tools like AI and on social media. There is just a barrage of information, and it becomes more and more difficult for everyone, not just our students, for our faculty and our staff and employees, to parsing that out to see what's true and what is just misinformation. So how do we get ahead of that so that students in elementary school and middle school are thinking critically about what they're seeing in the media and what they're seeing on social, what they're seeing coming out of ChatGPT and AI, so they can really do their own research and understand what is scientific, what are the facts, what's the truth, so that they can make good judgments for themselves. I think that's one of the biggest issues that we're facing. That's going to continue to get more and more and more complicated. We're going to have to reach further and further down at younger and younger ages to help people understand how they interpret and how they see the information that's coming to them.
Well, it's very impressive, the depth of your program. So I listened to it. I was for a number of years on Diana Wall's advisory committee for her program. You didn't mention your research on the ice and on the Arctic and ice issues, which is a whole other new element that we have to understand. I think there may be some discussion of that today or tomorrow at the AREDAY program. Bill Ritter, do you want to give a quick comment or an overview as to what gets you really excited and angry when you get up in the morning about what's going on?
Angry. Well, it is pretty fascinating to do the work that we do. We work with governors. We work on clean energy and climate. We work across the aisle, R's and D's, but we know which states are a little more difficult to work in or a lot more difficult to work in. And so there was a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Brandeis, who said states are laboratories of democracy. But what we're seeing too, that states can be laboratories of anti-democracy. And we, after the insurrection on January 6th, 19 states passed legislation to further limit voting rights, basically narrowing voting rights. If you took those 19 states and said, how is it to work in those states on climate policy? It's really difficult. It's really difficult. And you used the word that I love, inextricably tied. You can't work on environmental stuff and climate stuff without healthy democratic institutions, particularly if you want democracy to deliver on the promise of socioeconomic equity. And so in states where they're limiting participation, it often has a disproportionate effect on minorities. So people of color, but also, people who are in lower income groups, things of that nature, and working on sort of climate, environment, and democracy and healthy democratic institutions. It all comes together. And without it, we see, I think, a real peril to the health of democracy in America when you have, 20, 21, 22 states who are, in a sense, doing things that I would consider anti-democratic.
Excellent. Great segment. Bill, again, let me suggest to everybody that you sign up for Becker's newsletter. It's absolutely terrific. 2 or 3 times a week. Gets you really thinking about the climate world and the energy world and what the challenges are and why you should get more fired up than you might be already. So Bill, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Senator. I appreciate that a lot. I'm a journalist by trade and mostly by practice, although I spent 15 years at the Department of Energy in the renewable energy field. But like all journalists, I know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about much else. So little bits, and I'm not humbled by educated incapacity, and I think you'll see that in the comments I make. The way I approach this, and sometimes it's a little difficult to think of what the conjunction between democracy and climate change might be, but the system we have today, with all its challenges and problems, are the product of a democracy that we've had the last 250 years or so, the Constitution we have, the body of laws we have, and the influence of special interest on those bodies and laws. So there really is very direct connection because the system of governance we have right now is producing climate change. So we need to start by changing the system of governance, by removing the obstacles to doing the right thing, which is just as important as inventing the technologies to do the right thing. And so there's a huge role for rethinking democracy, rethinking governance, and figuring out how in this new time, which is radically different than the old time, we're going to have a country like this and one that's sustainable and survivable.
Great, well, that's good. Thank you very much. We all probably watched the January 6th hearings, and what a great service that was in outlining for the American people what had happened. Great detail, really brought that to so many people in a very clear and thoughtful way. But there was one major theme that was missing all the way through. Jason touched on it a little bit, I think. We saw what happened, but there has not been a really comprehensive discussion as to why this happened. Why did this occur? Why did so many people come together in Washington? Why so much disaffection, which Jason has talked about a little bit? Why so much disaffection with the world in which we now operate politically, governmentally, economically? That's a haunting question for us all, and maybe a good way for us. I don't know, what's our timing now, Chip? Tell me that.
You guys are full, yeah, we'll let you know when.
Let me know. I mean, is that 5 minutes or half an hour? Or
You have,
okay, well, there's soon enough time. So that's a pretty broad question, and I might ask each of you to take a whack at that and see what you think. Maybe Nick, we'd love to hear from you and your experience, and or you can put on your red hat and sing to us too. Or you want to.
Well, thanks, Tim. And let me, before I go on, I just want to also mention I recommend Tim's newsletter, which I subscribe to, and there's a ton of great information there. What you're talking about is tribalism. You're talking about people feeling like they either belong or they don't belong. and they align themselves with people who share their values, who've been told that they share values with those people. And if there is some dissatisfaction, of course they're going to act together, in that case violently, and based on a lot of misinformation. The only thing that I can really say from my perspective is that as a musician, playing bluegrass for decades, I played a lot of music in the South. I played all kinds of festivals and on farms and in rural places and fundraisers for fire stations, and I did all the things in every state. All kinds of opportunities to meet and engage with people who have very different backgrounds from my own, and we found a common ground in the music that we both appreciated, that we all appreciated. And so my role as a performer and as a host of a radio show has been to use the arts to try to build community and forge those connections that cross barriers and borders, because ultimately the tribalism part is the easiest path. It's the easiest thing to align yourself with people who share your grievances, and then you can build on that energy of grievances, and that's what January 6th was about. So my goal is to try to bridge those gaps, in my case using my skills as a musician. But there are other ways, clearly, as Jason and all of you know, that we have to do that.
Excellent, thank you. Bill Ritter, you've run for public office. We look back on running you and I in really a very different era. What do you think has happened? How do you answer the question that I'm posing?
I liked Jason's description of tribalism and the issue around belonging. I do think he's right that it is a democracy recession. There's a great book written by a Princeton professor who spent 10 years in rural America. It's called The Left Behind. Now this is only about the rural-urban divide. It's not about other kinds of divides that exist. I think the equity divide has gotten much worse, and so there's an equity gap. But this is just about rural America feeling left behind by conversations that are happening in state capitals or in Washington, D.C. And a lot of people want to lay the blame of a lot that's going on with Freedom Caucus or conservative politicians. This is something that the Democratic Party has to take a lot of responsibility for, of making rural people not feel like they're part of the conversation. They don't belong, and that they don't understand that value or community values are very important to people in a lot of America, even if they're not the vast part of the population. So you can go into eastern Colorado and you don't see a sign that there's a Democrat running for office anywhere, but mostly it's because those people don't feel like the conversations in Denver, and they talk about it this way, what's happening in Denver, like it's this other place, and not that they're not a part of it. And it's, again, when Amy talked about our extension services in rural Colorado, it's where we really probably have the ability to do something unique as a research university, is make people, well, just have a conversation with them, listen to people who are in those places, and get them to a place where, again, they feel like they belong. The last thing I'll say is this. I just attended the Athens Democracy Forum with John Powers and Spike Buckley and some other folks from CU and CSU and ASU. And I was reading a little bit about this. And in Athens, they had a war in 400 AD. And after that war, it was Sparta. After the war, there was a philosopher, and he thought about democracy, and he said, here's the reason democracy survives. It's because people respect the rule of law. It's because they still can find common purpose with the other side, and they accept difference. And I think, Tim, in our politics, we've gotten to a place where there's less and less acceptance of difference, less search for common purpose, and we've seen people who are leaders in this country who have abandoned the rule of law.
Amy, this is an invitation to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate so much of what Jason Crow said on that video. It was really remarkable. And what it makes me think, and this is actually a question back to you, Senator and Governor, is when he talks about historic levels of vitriol and divisiveness and democracy in recession, I believe that that's true. What I worry about leading a large university that's charged with creating the next leaders of our democracy is that right now all these young people are looking at the state of politics and saying, I want nothing to do with that. that's ugly business. Those people are, you know, violent and divisive. And so we, at a time when we need our best and brightest young people wanting to be governors and senators, they're turning away from it, right? Saying, I want nothing to do with that. How do we turn that tide so that we're training people saying, we want to jump into that fire, not run away from it. Now is the time we want to inspire them to start running for office at all levels and getting into this to help pull us back from the brink here where they're turning away and not wanting to be it. So how do we, in my position, inspire our young people to want to do what you did and run for office?
I think the climate work is part of it. I think that's something that young people resonate with, and that's a noble calling. And obviously the political leadership is required to make it effective. So I mean, I think you're on it. You know, I think you're doing it by leading with sustainability and climate work to inspire young people and recognizing the connection between democracy and climate.
Bill? Becker?
Yeah, I really agree with the tribalism dynamic that's going on, but it's a very complicated, toxic soup that we're dealing with. A little bit more about the tribalism thing, though. It's not only that we have tribes in the country, we have intolerant tribes, and are competing in a way for the future of the country. I think of Christian nationalists and white supremacists who think that the population is becoming too diverse, so that the white population is out, loses control of the country. But I think, it's going to be interesting to see when those tribes begin to fight against each other instead of against democracy and the way the country is right now. If I can wax a little bit new age, I think people need to come to the realization that they have their tribe, it might be their family, and their neighborhood, and their card club or whatever it might be the state, it might be the nation, it might be their race, but these tribes are concentric. Each one is a part of the larger tribe. And that goes all the way into, I think probably extraterrestrials, I don't know, I'm not for sure. But if we can understand that we are all part of these concentric tribes, they come together when we're in crisis a lot of times, or in war, where we all bind together and fight the danger. But we need to have that consciousness of the fact that we are part of many, 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 many larger tribes with mutual interests and need to respect one another.
At the Athens Democracy Forum, there's a panel on Africa. And the turn of the century, next turn of the century, 1 out of every 4 people in the world will be living in Africa. And so it's part of what you're saying, and there's a climate tie here and a climate justice tie. We're only about 4% of the global carbon footprint, and here people are bearing some of the worst and the worst impacts of it. Now, that takes it, I was just trying to make your point that I think it's a part of the concentric circle that's going to change pretty dramatically, and we have to understand as Americans what role we want to play in trying to lead that change in a positive way for both democracy and for climate. And Nick, I totally agree that it's inextricably twined. I'd just like to answer Amy's question, I think, that you posed, and it's education. And it's like trying to think about, in a world of disseminating misinformation, how to be the honest broker and not be partisan, but just be the honest broker about what it means to be civic and what it means to be civil inside of civics.
And this is a pretty deep discussion, and I think absolutely terrific. I'd like to get a little more particular now to bring it back up. Say, who's inflaming this tribalism? Who's inflaming the tribalism?
Not me.
I mean, what do you think? Who's out there? I will tell you. I think one of the we've heard some of it in the earlier panels today. I think some of the biggest problem is the industry that is so deeply embedded in our society. For fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry that has a very, very narrow set of purposes, but a very broad swath across the country. And it makes it very difficult to do anything politically, and whether it's at the local level or the state level or wherever. I mean, just remarkably to see now the resistance among large parts of the fossil fuel community to the idea of moving ahead very rapidly on electric vehicles and on renewable energy and power plants. Just extraordinary, 2 such obvious things to do. And now a significant effort going on, well organized, well understood, from an industry that runs great greenwash advertising about the wonderful things that they're doing, but if you look a little deeper, it's very dangerous. Bill Becker, you've thought a lot about this. And let me turn it over to you.
Thanks. If we've learned anything in the last 30 years, is that we cannot trust the fossil fuel industry. They lied to us about the science at the beginning. They covered up their own science. Then they began to discredit the scientists and the science and on and on and on. And now they're in the greenwashing phase. If they say anything to us, don't trust them. Okay? I mean, that's a little severe, but I'll give you an idea. You'll hear commonly that we subsidize, the federal government subsidizes fossil fuels to the tune of $20 billion a year, more or less. The actual figure is $650 billion a year, and some say $750 billion a year when you count the social, the environmental, and the economic damage of that industry. And we have a government formed around that industry, formed in part by that industry, and we let it hide many of the costs of that industry to society and to the environment. So there's a tremendous amount of money that could be spent in better ways. And I'm not saying that we need to shut off the spigot immediately. It needs to be a sensitive approach that takes care of the workers and communities that thrive on it. But we have to stop trusting that industry and get on with business. And carbon capture and sequestration is one of those things we should not trust, by the way.
Yeah, I just think about Colorado and think, you know, we have transitioned in Colorado in terms of the power of the fossil fuel industry, the lobbying power of it. I mean, we're a state where the major utilities have these very ambitious goals. We're not going to have any coal burned in Colorado after 2031. We just redid the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to call it the Energy Management, Energy and Carbon Management Commission. We have given local government more power over permitting in oil and gas and just done a variety of things that the industry opposed, but we had the leadership in the state, and we currently have leadership in the state house, that I think are willing to tackle issues even with a lobby that's not as effective as it was 15 years ago, but it still has some staying power. And it's a good example that you can do that and not just survive, but have an economy that grows and grows in a very much a 21st century way. So states, again, can provide some examples about how to handle a very powerful lobby in a meaningful way and grow your economy still.
Senator Wirth, if I could make one little footnote that I forgot to mention, that $650 billion number is not one I pulled out of the air. That is the result of an analysis by the International Monetary Fund, which said worldwide the subsidies are $7 trillion a year. So that's where I got that.
Global trends are moving, in the direction that Bill is indicating. We've had again in Colorado. I mean, lots of progress being made globally, and then for the first time, the International Energy Agency is saying that that we will reach the peak of fossil fuel use in the world by 2030. And that's a very conservative but very, very important international kind of scorekeeping agency. And I used to depend upon them extensively for their analyses. And I was really very surprised to see that and heartened by that. I was heartened by another analysis that I recently saw, that if we get to the point of not burning slowing down our fossil fuel burning, so that by the time we get to 2050, we're at zero fossil fuel emissions. At that time, it would take 3 years for the whole environment of the globe to restabilize. I mean, how quickly it would happen once we get to that key critical point in 2050. The take-up of electric vehicles and how rapidly that's occurred. The speed with which solar's been gone on. All of these are very heartening. They're very heartening, but it's important to keep in mind that these forces are out there at all times. This is not a kumbaya situation. It's a very difficult and hard challenge. I've been looking in the last month at the most recent, and I may be wrong about this, but the most recent discussions of working on the ozone problem in Colorado. We're not really getting anywhere. Even though we have a government that you would assume would be quite progressive, we're not getting anywhere because for the most part, we've neglected to look at the emissions from automobiles, transportation emissions. You know, that's the biggest problem for ozone, and that's the biggest public health problem that we're having in the state of Colorado. But we're still not willing to undertake that. Why? Well, right back to the tentacles of the Fossil Fuel Committee. Anyway, Amy, you guys have done a wonderful job at CSU of embracing the challenges that we face, and your presentation today was really impressive. You might want to comment on this. I don't want to leave this on a bummer downside, but I think it's important to recognize, you know, while we got a big problem, what it looks like, and that there's a balance in all of this. Amy?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance in all of this. I was struck by, actually this week we had our Board of Governors meeting. So the Board of Governors of CSU meets up on campus a couple times a year. And the number of times that climate change in different areas was brought up during the meeting was remarkable. We started out the day with public comment, and we had a divest group come and protest at the meeting about the CSU Foundation divesting and fossil fuels, which the CSU Foundation is already almost completely divested. That's how we become the #1 sustainable university in the country, is it's very low single digits already. But they wanted to come and talk about divesting just as a general matter across the country, and so they came with their signs and protests, and that was their focus. And a little bit later on in the day, we had students appear with faculty members who were part of our ag sciences, who are working on microbiome work and are working on animal waste and the major role that plays in climate change and whatnot, really energized and positive and focused on being part of the solution. So the topic is present in all of these different types of ways, whether it's research, whether it's student voicing protest, whether it's just embedding it within the operations of the university. So I think to your point earlier, you know, it's really taken hold. Students are expecting to go to universities and know that their university leadership understands it, appreciates it, that they're learning about it, that there's futures for them in it regardless of what they're interested in. And that's really on us to figure out how to funnel that energy and enthusiasm toward these solutions. And there's sort of an endless variety of ways in which we can do that. But students are expecting it, and we really have to answer that call.
Nick, you're nodding your head as if you're... Go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's 5 minutes left. Yeah, I just got to get the nose. The thing that's I agree with all this stuff. Let me just all I was going to say is that to pick up on something that Jason said in his video, which is that the opportunity exists for all of us to reframe this dialogue around the climate work as patriotism. This is fundamentally patriotic work, and things that fly in the face of that are fundamentally unpatriotic. And that's a conversation that's obvious. It's an argument that's winnable. It's a reframing of the dialogue, so it doesn't feel like it's partisan. It doesn't feel like it's liberal versus conservative. This is fundamental patriotism, and I think there's an opportunity for us to reframe this opportunity in that way.
Very good. Bill?
We haven't talked about this, but it gets down to this reformation of democracy in a time of climate change. It gets down to some very specific things. What about the Supreme Court? Should there be time-limited terms? Should we pack it? What about Congress, which since 1992, when we signed the first world agreement on climate change, has done nothing until the IRA, and that's not enough either. Why? Well, we know about the power of special interests and financing of campaigns. There's a whole restructuring that has to go on at an institutional level to deal with some of the problems we're talking about at a more theoretical level. And I try to get into that in my columns, but we need to think about how we need to change government, the mechanics of it, at a nitty-gritty level so that these things don't happen anymore.
Well, you all we're sliding right to the end of our time here, and let me again thank AREDAY for inviting us to come together. It's a terrific panel, and in listening to this, I'm right in the process of reading Robert Cairo's long biography of Lyndon Johnson. I don't know how many of you read it, 4 volumes, of incredible detail. And right in the middle of the volume on the Senate, it becomes clear that the way in which he focused on making progress was figuring out one step at a time, how to step one related to the one I took 3 weeks ago. That incredible patient march and that led to his remarkable contributions before the crash of the Vietnam War. But it was a real lesson in politics, and I wish I had known that when I went into politics and went into Congress. I wish I'd read that, because it's a real guideline for anybody trying to make progress in this very large and complicated democratic society. It's very moving and very important, and it's great work. And what everybody here on the dais here has done is all great work, and what goes on is really impressive. And it's a privilege to be, I can say this, Amy, welcome, but it's a privilege to be a Boulderite. There's so many of us engaged in this, and it's a great place to come from, and a great place to move away, up, and go get it. Thank you all very much.